Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. This is a very, very important program that we're hosting today for patients, and mainly because in the MPN space, for the first time in years, we have so many drugs in clinical trials and so much happening in hopes of bringing new drugs to commercialization for our MPN patients. Currently, we only have two. So there's a lot of hope and a lot of good things coming down the pipeline. And so we've talked in our space here and with our colleagues and with other patients about the importance of clinical trials. We know for sure that many of our patients have participated in these trials. Some have participated in multiple trials. And you'll hear from a patient later this morning, who has done just that. We're very excited about the people speaking today. You will hear from Dr. Kristen Pettit from the University of Michigan, who does a beautiful presentation on just very basic clinical trials 101. If you go to our website on our homepage, you can click on the clinical trials box and you will get an abundance of information about what you should know about participating in a trial, how a trial works, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, what those mean, what those numbers mean, and then how your participation helps everybody, helps the entire MPN community. We are very pleased to have our sponsors with us, and the reason why we bring our industry partners with us to these events is for that reason, for the very reason I just said. We have so much going on in the field of MPNs. And, you know, when I first started in 2005 in this disease area, there were maybe 1 or 2 things happening with different companies. And now we have, as you'll see the list next to me, the logos next to me, there are so many more possibilities for all of you. So we thank them. We're glad they're participating today. You will hear from each one of them about their actual trials and get a more specific update from them. But I would like to thank all of them at this point. Insight Corporation, Geron, Protagonist, CTI Biopharma, Pharmacentia, AbbVie, Constellation, Sierra, Bristol Myers Squibb, Acceleron, Imago Biosciences, and Cartos. I mean, every time I read this list, I think, my God, you know, we have come so far. And now I started in 2005 in the MPN space, so it's been some years have passed, but boy, I'm just so proud of everything that's going on. I do want to tell you that you can send questions to me. It'll come to me, and we will ask those questions of either our 2 speakers, Dr. Kurkendal or Dr. Pettit, and also our industry partners. If you have a question, please feel free to post that to me, and I will try to have time to ask it. These are important times for all of us. I want to share with you what Dr. Mesa has always asked me to say to each of you, that if the vaccine is available to you, please get it. It will not interfere with your medications. You should be fine, and it's absolutely vital to your safety going forward this year. So I'm going to check to see if Kristen is with us, and it looks like she is. Dr. Kristen Pettit from the University of Michigan. Some of you have heard from her in the past at some of our programs. We are so delighted she's with us. Hello, Kristen. And she is going to present on clinical trials. First, she's going to give you an update on what's going on at the University of Michigan, and then she will go into her program on, or her presentation, I'm sorry, on Clinical Trials 101. She does a beautiful job with this. So please listen and send me questions as we go along. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. It's so good to be here with everybody. I figured I'd talk a little bit about just clinical trials in general, just give everybody a brief introduction. And then I think Andrew Kurkendal, who's talking a little bit later, is going to go into more specifics about individual clinical trials, but I'm happy to stop at any point or take questions at any point, so please just stop me. I wanted to start with a little piece of optimism for 2021. Some of the good things that have come out of this pandemic era. There's not many, but I think there's a few. One is the creativity. I spent way too much, probably embarrassingly large amount of time watching these, the Shed Aquarium penguins from Chicago walk around the Shed Aquarium and visit with their neighbor animal friends. So I think there's been some cute, creative things that have come out of all of this. I think connections have been really unique and novel during this time too. Being able to sit with people like this from around the country via Zoom, I think is very nice. It's not the same as in person, but at least the accessibility is increased. And along with that, being able to do virtual visits with your doctors, I think is a long overdue thing that the COVID pandemic really accelerated. Parking is nice too. If you come to the medical center to see your doctors, at least here at University of Michigan, we have parking for once because there are more virtual visits happening and fewer people coming in person. So that's sort of nice. And then I think the last nice piece is being able to watch the drug development process at work in real time and with some, I think, pretty impressive degree of transparency. I think it's been really amazing to see this incredibly safe and effective group of vaccines and other medications be made, tested, and available at a really incredible pace with a lot of transparency. So in this era, I'm finding in clinic that when I talk to my patients about clinical trials, there's a lot less mystery around them right now because of what people are seeing on the news about COVID treatments going through these various phases of trials. And I think that's a really good thing to kind of demystify the process of clinical trials. So that's what I'd like to do a little bit more today and show them how they can help you and how you can help others by participating in them as well. And I'm getting a little pop-up here that my connection isn't great. Can you hear me and see me okay?
You are fine.
Okay, good. All right, sounds good. And here at work, you would think my internet connection would be perfect, but it cuts out frequently. So please stop me if you can't hear or see anything. Okay, so this is what I was going to talk about briefly in the next 25-30 minutes. What clinical trials are, what are their goals, what are the different phases that they go through, how clinical trials are conducted, how we ensure the ethics and safety of clinical trials for participants, other ways to participate in MPN research if a clinical trial isn't for you, and then provide some more resources for more information about clinical trials. So first, what are clinical trials? The term clinical trials really refers to a pretty broad group of research, but the definition is really any research that we're doing that involves a healthcare intervention, whether that's a specific medication treatment, whether it's a certain preventative strategy, whether it's a screening mechanism, or a lifestyle intervention like exercise or nutrition. And it's important to remember, I think, that every new treatment breakthrough that we have comes as a direct result of a clinical trial and of all the participants who have taken part in a clinical trial. So we really have a lot to owe for to owe people who have participated in these situations, both from a research standpoint and from a participant standpoint. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about participating in a clinical trial. I think the most important thing is that it's got to be a personal decision. It depends a lot on your medical situation, on your values, on your social situation, on the logistics. I think all of those things have to go into making this decision for you. There are a few situations where we generally start talking about participating in a clinical trial. Generally, when the standard treatment that's out there isn't good enough, which I would say is the case for basically all MPNs. I think we've made huge strides in myelofibrosis, ET, PV, and the other MPNs, but I think that most of us would feel comfortable saying that the standard treatments that we have just aren't good enough in general. Another situation would be when there is no standard treatment for your situation. We have that in some cases right now in MPNs, particularly things like myelofibrosis situations when the blood counts are very low. We don't have great standard treatments for that situation. And then also when there's promising or interesting new treatment that you qualify for. And we'll talk about a few of these specifically, I think, later in the session. And when you're willing to accept the risks that go along with clinical trials and adhere to the plan and the treatment course that goes along with the particular clinical trial. So this is just a general outline of how drug development works in brief, and I'm going to go through each of these phases in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So first we identify or develop a new drug, and to first test how safe it is and how effective it is, we start with what are called preclinical studies. This is everything that happens before a drug ever goes into a human being. And this is a very long phase of study. So new drugs will be tested in individual cancer cells, in a petri dish, or in a test tube in the lab. That generally takes a couple of years to see how well this drug actually kills these individual cancer cells and how it affects other cells or tissues in the body. Then it moves on to being tested in animals. Generally, mice is the first way that this is tested, but sometimes other animals too, to get an idea for both the efficacy of the drug and a lot on as far as side effects go and any toxicity issues that may come up. And if a drug is found to be effective and safe and tolerable in these preclinical studies, that's when it goes forward into what are called phase 1 studies, which are the first studies in human beings. Phase 1 studies move relatively slowly, purposefully, to be able to test the drugs in great detail, make sure there's no safety issues, make sure we aren't putting people at any increased risk or unnecessary risk. In phase 1 studies, there are generally just a small number of patients, 15 to 30, sometimes it's larger depending on the situation. And the primary goal of these early phase 1 first studies in human beings are to determine the safety of the drug and define the optimal dose of a drug. After drugs complete phase 1 studies, if these are successful, then they move on to phase 2. In phase 2 studies tend to be a bit larger, more like on the range of 100 patients or so. And this is where we start to determine, really whittle down a bit better how effective this drug might be for a specific disease at the dose that we've determined to be the safest, most tolerable dose. Then after that, drugs move into the phase 3 portion, which are much larger studies, anywhere from hundreds of patients to thousands of patients, sometimes tens of thousands of patients, as we've seen in some of these vaccine studies with 30,000 plus patients. In phase 3 studies, this is really where we determine whether the drug is more effective than the current standard treatment or than placebo if there is no current standard treatment. All in all, this whole process takes quite some time, on average about 12 years to move from preclinical studies all the way through phase 3 studies and then on to drug approval and availability. And it's very costly as well. On average, $2.56 billion with a B. To bring a drug to market through these various different steps. So to talk a little bit more about the individual phases of clinical trials, phase 1 studies or safety trials, I mentioned the purpose is really to identify the safe dose of a new drug and to determine how it should be given, whether it's oral or IV, if there are different options, and to study the possible side effects and how the drug affects the human body. So these are usually relatively small, 15 to 30 patients. All participants get the same treatment. There's no placebo generally in phase 1 studies, but the medication may be given at different doses or schedules. So some people may get lower doses and then kind of escalating up the ladder as we're seeing the drug be safe at higher and higher doses. Some people may get something like an oral drug, while other people get an IV formulation, depending on if that's available for the individual drug. And usually in phase 1 studies, there's a lot of follow-up at the study center. So there's a lot of back and forth. There are a lot of blood draws to see how the drug is affecting your body and how your body is metabolizing the drug too. So there's a lot of learning that goes on in these early phase 1 trials. The phase 2 trials, which are getting more into the efficacy phase, is really where we're whittling down in a very particular patient population how well this drug works for a certain condition. It's hard to say that in some phase 1 studies where we're starting at a really, really, really low dose and then going up really slowly. But the phase 2, that's where we have what we think is going to be the safest and most effective dose. And we're really trying to figure out exactly how well this works or doesn't work, is the case may be. And at the same time, we're continuing to learn about side effects and the safety of the drugs. These are usually relatively large studies, 100 patients or so, though it's pretty variable. Usually all patients get the same treatment in phase 2 trials. There's usually not a placebo group or a control group. Usually everybody getting the same thing. And we're usually trying to focus on a more uniform group of patients too. In phase 3, these are really the comparison trials. So purpose is to compare the new drug to the current standard. In vaccine trials that were going on for COVID, of course, the current standard is nothing else preventative for COVID infections. So patients were randomized to get either the COVID vaccine or a placebo shot. So an inert, basically a sugar water shot in the arm. Phase 3 studies are usually randomized in that way, like the COVID vaccine studies have been, meaning it's a kind of a flip of a coin. A computer flips a coin basically and decides whether the person sitting in front of the computer is going to get either the vaccine or the placebo. And as was the case with the vaccine studies, these may be blinded, meaning the computer makes that decision which group the patient goes into, but the patient doesn't know which treatment they're getting. And it may be also double blinded, meaning the investigator or the treating doctor also doesn't know which group the patient is getting and which treatment the patient is getting. And by doing that, we can remove a lot of the biases that can go into these data and determining how well this treatment is working or isn't working. Not all phase 3 studies have a placebo group. In cases where we have a standard treatment, so myelofibrosis, for example, some of these phase 3 trials may compare something like Jacobi or ruxolitinib, which we'll talk a little bit more about, versus Jacobi or ruxolitinib plus something new. So, or versus a completely different type of medication. So it may be the standard compared to something new. So it may not be that there's a placebo involved at all. So I wanted to take you through the example of ruxolitinib or Jacobi, which has really been the groundbreaking drug in our field of MPNs. So we know these JAK2 mutations were first identified in patients with MPNs in 2005. Then ruxolitinib, which is an inhibitor of JAK2, JAK1 and JAK2, was developed shortly after. It went through preclinical studies and phases 1 through 3 of clinical trials very quickly. And ruxolitinib was then approved by the FDA in 2011 for intermediate or high risk myelofibrosis, and then subsequently in 2015 as a second line treatment for polycythemia vera. So I wanted to show you what some of these, just kind of examples of ruxolitinib and what some of these different phases of studies looked like with ruxolitinib or Jacobi. This is what some of the preclinical studies look like. This is kind of the readout that we get. This is looking in cell lines, different cells from the patients have contributed, different samples patients have contributed with MPNs. So these are MPN cells, and seeing how effective the drug is at inhibiting these cell growths. So we want to see very, this here is % inhibition. So we want to see a lot of inhibition with the drug. And we see that was the case with Jacobi up here at different doses compared to placebos. Then we look at the spleen weight in mice with MPNs, and we see that Jacobi very nicely decreased the spleen weight compared to vehicle, is what we call it in when we use animal models, but basically compared to a placebo. I'm about to show a kind of a gross picture, so this is my my trigger warning here. If you're squeamish or if you don't want to see something a little bit gross, you may want to just turn away for a moment, and I'll tell you when it's safe to look back. But I'm about to show some spleens. So this is the example of the spleen weight decreasing, and this is the example of how spleens look in the mice. This is the spleens of mice with myeloproliferative neoplasms, and then this is the example of the spleens after JAK inhibitor treatment with Jacobi. So you can see the kind of ruler over here for scale, and you can see how nicely these spleens shrunk down. Okay, sorry about that. Well, safe to look back now. Okay, so then in the case of Jacobi, we were pretty confident that that we had what was going to be a safe and effective drug that was going to move forward quickly in patients with MPNs. So in those situations, oftentimes the phase 1 and 2 portions of these trials are kind of combined and smushed together so things can move a little bit more quickly, which is what happened with Jacobi. So the initial phase 1 and 2 trial, which was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of our really premier academic medical journals, this involved 153 patients, so pretty large size study for myeloproliferative neoplasms. And they tested the drug at several different doses and schedules. So once a day versus twice a day, low dose, medium dose, high dose as time went on. And this is kind of the readout that we see from these clinical trials. We see the baseline characteristics of these 153 patients. Don't worry, I won't walk through all this. I just wanted to give you an example of the type of information that we're collecting in these clinical trials and the type of information we're looking at down the road as far as what patients were experiencing before even starting this drug. And then this is a readout of what patients were experiencing on this trial after starting this drug. So these are possible side effects that developed in patients on Jacobi early on. We grade the side effects as far as how severe they are, grade 1 through 4. And you can see these percentages are pretty low. Not many people had a lot of bothersome side effects, and especially the grade 3 and 4 more severe side effects were very, very rare. So this study really showed that this was going to be a very safe and well-tolerated drug to move forward with. And then this is kind of in the phase, I just wanted to show here too, in the phase 1-2 trial, we were also looking at the responses, not just the tolerability or side effects, but also some of the responses, both the spleen sizes and the symptom scores for patients improving. And we saw really at all the different doses, we saw some degree of efficacy, but we used this information to help us determine what the dose of the drug should be moving into the phase 3 study and then afterwards. In the phase 3 study of Jacobi, there are actually 2 different phase 3 studies that were done, one in the US that's shown on the left here, and then one in Europe that's shown on the right. The US study had 309 patients participate, and the European study had 219 patients participate. You can see kind of the numbers that were randomized here. Since we didn't have a good treatment really before Jacobi or ruxolitinib, these patients were randomized to either get Jacobi or ruxolitinib versus the placebo in both groups. And this is some of the example of some of the efficacy that was seen in the US study at least. So in the patients that got placebo, what we're looking at here is the percent of spleen shrinkage in these patients. So we can see the scale here is from 0% shrinkage. So these are people who had just stable spleen sizes all the way up to 60% shrinkage. We see that patients who got a placebo, not surprisingly, didn't have a dramatic decrease in their spleen. It looks like I think it was 1 or 2 patients had a little bit of spontaneous decrease in their spleen volume. Whereas those who were treated with ruxolitinib or Jacobi, was a much higher percentage of them that had some reduction in their spleen volume. So kind of nice to be able to see this head-to-head comparison. There's really no substitute for being able to do these phase 3 trials and see this head-to-head comparison. Also something to note, people in this study, this early Jacobi study, this phase 3 Jacobi study, were allowed to cross over. What that means is if patients were getting the placebo and they weren't having a response or their spleen was growing over time, they were allowed to then switch, kind of be unblinded, find out which arm they were in and switch arms over to the Jacobi arm after a certain amount of time. So Jacobi is such a nice example because this happens really at twice the rate or half the amount of time as the standard development of new drugs. So this has really been a great example of drug development and a really, I think, kind of groundbreaking drug in this group of diseases. So a few things about how clinical trials are conducted. We use something that we call the protocol, which is a big stack of papers or a big file on our computers, anywhere from 100 to several hundred pages that explains everything that will happen as part of the trial, how we're going to identify patients, how we're going to treat them to make sure we're treating them all uniformly, how we're going to manage any side effects that come up, how we're going to report back to the FDA and to our own institutions, how we're going to analyze the data. Everything is included in this big protocol for us conducting the trial. On the patient end of things, you generally don't see that big, thick protocol. What you generally see is what's called an informed consent form, which is still usually a pretty thick document, so anywhere from 15 to 25 or so pages that explains everything as a participant that, that you would probably want to know about the trial in more lay language. So it explains the purpose of the trial, any procedures or tests that you will go through as part of the study, any risks, really everything that you would want to know about expectations going into a clinical trial up front. This is also used to just document the participant's understanding of what will happen, but an informed consent document is never a commitment to stay in the study. I think that's an important thing to remember, is that if you do participate in clinical research or a clinical trial, you're under no commitment to stay in the clinical trial. If anything is not going the way you want it to go, if you're not having the response you want to have as far as your disease go, or if you have any side effects, you can always leave the trial at any point for any reason. So a lot of people are involved in the conduct of clinical trials, and most of them you won't see. The people who are visible generally are the participants, obviously, visible to their doctors. And then the investigators being the treating physicians. The sponsor is generally the person who is paying for and conducting and developing the study. So usually that's a pharmaceutical company, but it may be the individual doctor who has done this as well, or a small group of doctors. There are usually research nurses who are involved in following participants over time and making sure everything happens according to that protocol. There are study coordinators who also help coordinate everything that is supposed to go on as part of the protocol. There are data managers behind the scenes who you will never see, who are putting all the information together, making sure that none of your individual identifying information, your name, anything like that is included in all of the data, making sure all of that is taken off and de-identified. There are various different safety committees that I'll talk a little bit about. And then there's a whole financial team that deals with that aspect of it. So things to consider, one is eligibility for these clinical trials. So things that we think about when we're thinking about if a clinical trial might be right for somebody. The first thing is the disease. So where we're at in the disease process, what the diagnosis is, what the stage or the risk is, and what the symptoms are for the individual patient. For example, with myelofibrosis, we have some clinical trials or some medications that are really dedicated towards trying to improve anemia, for example, trying to improve the red blood cell count or the hemoglobin, but won't necessarily be expected to help some other aspects of the disease. So it's important to take that into consideration. Also prior treatments, whether patients have received the standard of care treatment or whether this is a brand new diagnosis and we're catching the person at a situation where we're just starting to talk about treatments, and whether a clinical trial might be an option right off the bat. And then other patient health considerations. So making sure that somebody's other health issues are well enough controlled and that the individual is healthy enough to consider this particular medication under study. So I think this is another part that I think participants or patients don't necessarily see visually a lot, but there are a lot of steps that go into protecting patients as part of a clinical trial, protecting patients' rights, protecting their medical safety, making sure that the study is open and available to all different people and that it's not discriminatory in any way. There are a lot of different things that go into this. So all clinical trials do have some inherent risks. By definition, in a clinical trial, we're testing a medication that hasn't been proven necessarily yet, but the risks very much depend on the individual situation. And any medication in general has inherent risks, so that's important to remember too. There are a ton of national and international regulations surrounding the safety and efficacy or safety and ethics, sorry, of clinical trial conduct, and we have to adhere to all of those very closely. The groups that help us do that and help us ensure that clinical trials are conducted as safely and ethically as possible include the US FDA. So every investigational clinical trial, every drug that we're testing goes through committees at the US FDA, and they make recommendations about what to do to make sure that these are done safely, and they have to sign off on these things before they get done. Each individual institution, each individual hospital has what's called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. This is a big team that's responsible for making sure that, that studies are done in a safe and ethically sound way. So people on the IRB are doctors, they're researchers, they're investigators, they're patients, they're people from the community, they're ethicists, they're sometimes social workers, a big group of people who read through these hundreds of pages of trials with a fine-tooth comb and make sure everything is as safe as physically possible and everything's being done the most correct way physically possible. Then there's the whole study team that are individually actually doing the study. And then there are usually groups similar to these things called Data and Safety Monitoring Boards, or DSMBs. These are independent groups, generally people that don't have any stake in the trial, that aren't actually participating in the trial, oftentimes other investigators in other disease areas, who periodically will sit down and audit everything that's going on in the trial, look through the patient's information who have been treated on the trial so far, look through what has happened, and make sure that there's no safety concerns, make sure everything's going according to plan. So all of this is very, very involved. So these are some frequently asked questions that I get when people are considering participating in a clinical trial. One that I hear a lot is the idea that clinical trials are only a last-ditch effort, or should only be done in kind of extreme situations where there's no other options. And I would say that I don't think that that's the case, especially in MPNs right now. I think we've learned so much about MPNs as far as the basic science, what drives these diseases from a genetic perspective, and from a basic science perspective. And now we have some treatments that are coming forward that are early still, so they're still being tested in clinical trials, but have already shown that they're quite safe and quite effective. So I think in MPNs right now, we're in a perfect situation where the answer to this first question is generally no, and oftentimes clinical trials are a good option even before anything else has been tried, because they can give you access to even newer, more exciting treatments. Second question, am I being experimented on? Well, kind of yes and no. Every clinical trial is technically an experiment of sorts. We're trying to learn more about a new treatment, that we're trying to improve things for patients. But at the same time, this isn't just a one-off experiment. As I've shown you, these clinical trials often take years of planning, and these drugs have already been often tested for many years, and oftentimes many other patients have received them before. So, so I think those are good things to remember. Who pays for trials? It depends. And oftentimes, or generally, anything non-standard is paid for by the study sponsor. So non-standard meaning the actual medication itself, you can't just take a prescription down to your pharmacy and pick it up for these investigational medications. So that is all provided by the study and the study sponsor. If we're doing extra things like CAT scans or MRIs or biopsies or blood draws, those are generally paid for by the study sponsor and not by your insurance company. But if there are just routine things, routine blood counts, routine visits, oftentimes those are still paid for through your insurance company. Those still go through the insurance like we would be doing anyways. Am I committed for any length of time? Not really. As I mentioned, with really any clinical trial, you can leave at any point for any reason. You don't even have to necessarily give a reason, but they'll generally ask that you agree to at least participate in some safety checkups, whether it's over the phone or in-person visits, to make sure that there aren't any side effects that have come up for your own safety. Does my participation exclude me from other clinical trials down the road? Sometimes, but usually not. It's pretty common in patients with MPNs that maybe we use a clinical trial drug and we get some response, and that's really exciting, but maybe it doesn't last forever. And as the response starts to wane, then we can consider another clinical trial down the road. So questions to ask. I think things to be really clear about when you're participating in a study is what phase is it in and what's the purpose of this individual study? Is this a phase 1 or versus a phase 3? That's important to know. How many patients are participating and how many have been treated already? Your doctor should be able to give you those answers to those questions, and what's been the experience so far with those patients overall, they sometimes can't reveal or don't know a lot of the specifics about specific numbers overall, but they can tell you kind of generally what the experience has been like. What are the expected side effects? What does the schedule look like? How often do you have to come back to the study center? Can you get any portion of your care close to home? That's all changed a little bit, thankfully, in the COVID era. Many of our trials are now allowing us to do some virtual visits and get blood draws closer to home and things like that, which I think has made some of these investigational options a little bit more accessible for folks. Are there any extra tests involved? What are the alternative treatment options? And how quickly should I make a decision? Sometimes we know if a clinical trial is just about to finish, or if we only need another patient or two, and then we're stopping it. That's good to know if you need to make a decision reasonably quickly, or whether it's very early on in the trial and you've got all the time in the world to think about it. How long will you be in the trial for? And can you leave at any point? And the answer to the last question is always yes. So I wanted to try to kind of end this with some more optimism too. So there are a lot of different clinical trials going on in MPNs right now. This is a great website, clinicaltrials.gov, if you haven't looked it up before. This is run by the NIH and fully available and open to anyone. You just go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can search for different trials in your disease area, things that are open, things that have already completed. You can search by the map, by where they're available geographically. So just searching, I just did this early today to get the most up-to-date information. So I just searched for myelofibrosis studies that are currently basically open, and I found 105 studies in myelofibrosis that are currently open across the country. So this is awesome. I did the same thing for ET, and there are 52 studies currently open. And same for PV, and there are 49 studies currently open. So there are things out there and there are options, and research is moving very quickly in a wonderful way in MPNs. There are lots of other ways to participate in MPN research and to help us learn more about these diseases going forward, even if a clinical trial isn't for you. There have been several lifestyle studies recently. You may have heard of a nutrient study or nutrition study, yoga study. There are, I think, a few other lifestyle studies that are out there that you can participate in. You can provide blood or bone marrow samples. If you're being seen at an academic medical center, most of us will have these options. We generally collect these samples to use to test new drugs or to figure out new things about the biology of these diseases in our laboratories. So we really appreciate having any of those samples that we can. There are observational studies, which are generally things like registries, where you can go online or go to an academic center and enter your information into a database, and we can use those for research as well. De-identified information without your name or your address or any of that identifying information. We have one at University of Michigan too that I wanted to mention, an MRI study where we're collecting groups of patients with MPNs, with ET, PV, and myelofibrosis at various stages of myelofibrosis. We're trying to see if we can use MRIs as opposed to bone marrow biopsies to try to actually see fibrosis in the bone marrow. So that's an example of an observational study where we're not actually doing anything treatment-wise to a group of patients, but we're studying them over time, and we're trying to develop a new technique. And there are other ways to participate, including serving on advisory committees like these IRB committees that I mentioned, or grant review committees that are out there to try to award money to different MPN research and things like that. More resources for your information. Your MPN doctor should be able to tell you about more specific clinical trials that might be available for your specific situation. The MPN Advocacy and Education website has a good list of clinical trials too that's up to date and has a great summary. Cancer.gov is a nice website too that describes more about just kind of generalities about clinical trial participation. The MPN Research Foundation.org has an excellent also summary of ongoing clinical trials to consider, and then that clinicaltrials.gov website that I showed. And I think that's all I've got, but I'm happy to take any questions. I think Andrew is planning on talking about some more specific clinical trials and drugs that are being developed coming up here. But I'm happy to take any questions in the meantime if we want to do questions.
That was great, Kristen. Thank you. We do have several questions. One from a physician who's a general oncologist, who asks, how can general oncologists and primary care physicians encourage their patients to get involved in a clinical trial?
I think that's an excellent question, and thank you for asking it. I think if you have access to an academic center like ours, University of Michigan, I know we work with a lot of general oncologists in Michigan and throughout the Midwest. I'm happy to provide my contact information, and if you have somebody like that who you can partner with and kind of know what in general they have to offer. I think if you have a particular patient that you're considering a clinical trial, it's usually just a matter of like an email or a text message asking, hey, do you have anything for this particular situation? And we can respond pretty quickly and say yes or no. I think it's hard right now or it's got to be hard right now from a general oncologist perspective to keep track of everything that's happening in MPNs, because the field has moved so quickly, and because these trials are moving so quickly in a good way. This is a good problem to have, that it's hard to keep up with the current pace of research. So I think that what I would suggest is having somebody that you can partner with, if you can, somebody at a local academic medical center. That's probably the best way. Searching clinicaltrials.gov is great too, but that can take a little bit of time.
So one of the questions we get often is, there are so many barriers to participating in a clinical trial. And so often the trials end up with the same groups of people or demographics of people. And so you don't really get a broad spectrum of the people in our society. And so, there have been conversations about microsites or different sites where more sites where people can leave home and go down the block, and they're able to do it. Or during these times, during the pandemic, there are companies, and you'll hear from a few of them, who are sending the drug to the person's home. They've done videos of how to use it and what to do. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's great. That's definitely been a positive about the COVID pandemic, that I think accessibility is getting a little bit better, and the pandemic has kind of accelerated that. I think we were moving in that direction, but I think the COVID pandemic really pushed us that way a little bit faster. You're right, though. There's a lot of inequality issues and access issues in terms of clinical trials. So both socioeconomically, gender biases too. Women are definitely underrepresented in clinical trials as a whole. Definitely racial or ethnic biases. So I think, yes, it's very important for us to reach out to these and try to get a picture of our population as a whole as part of these clinical trials, because if we're leaving a group of these studies, there may be issues with these drugs that we don't learn about up front that are important to know. So yes, I think it's great when studies can be done at like satellite centers, can be done at different local places, or even just portions of studies. But it all depends on what's going on with the study and the drug. If it's a very early phase 1 study where we're just at the beginning of learning about a drug, most things are going to have to be done at the academic center, so we can keep a very close eye on what's going on with the person and identify any issues very quickly. But if these are more later drugs or combinations of drugs that we know a fair amount about already, oftentimes we can work things out as far as trying not to bring people back too often, trying to do lab draws closer to home, trying to do virtual visits or even visits with their local provider in between, things like that. So I think it's getting better, but I don't think it's as good as it could be.
I agree wholly with that. But I think the reason why we have such a strong relationship with our industry partners, because frankly, they all really want to help and want to be play an active role in helping patients be able to participate. So I think it's good that this discussion takes place here. Also, so we've, now that we've had the vaccine out there for a few months, and more of our patients are being vaccinated, have you seen in your practice any adverse side effects? And we'll hear from Dr. Kurkendal as well, any adverse side effects that are particular to MPN patients?
I haven't, but I'll say that with the caveat that the rollout's been very slow here in Michigan. So I haven't had very many patients actually be vaccinated yet, outside of my patients who are healthcare providers as well. Really, the University of Michigan hasn't gotten much further than healthcare providers, unfortunately, yet. Of course, that's happening actively as we speak right now. But I'll say I just came off of our hospital service that I was attending on for the last 2 weeks. And our whole group, our whole doctor group up there and medical student group, we all just got our second dose within the same 2-day period last week. And one person had low-grade fevers and the rest of us had nothing. So I know we're not MPN patients. I know that's not the question you asked, but it was very tolerable for all of us. And I'm not expecting to see any unexpected side effects in patients with MPNs. And as Anne mentioned, there shouldn't be any issues with drug interactions, but of course, ask your MPN doctor if you have concerns about it.
And I always say this because Dr. Massa is our scientific advisor and of course frequent speaker at our programs, but he's absolutely encouraging our patients to get the vaccine. He has not seen anything adverse at this point, but you know, again, it's slow in most states, but he's also a real proponent of, and I am too, of getting the vaccine. One more question for you. Pardon me?
Add me to that list of proponents of getting it.
Thank you. And again, I'm going to ask Dr. Kurkendal some of these questions. This last question, I've been in 3 clinical trials. God love this person. Currently momelotinib for the past 6 years, and it isn't working as well after 6 years. My platelets have dropped between 50 to 65. I'm allergic to Jakafi, so that's out of the question. Are there any trials for those with low platelets? When JAK inhibitors don't shrink my spleen, is there anything else that might? And this person is triple negative.
Yeah, I think the patients with low platelets, that is a tricky situation because most of the drugs that we have, or many of the drugs that we have that we're studying, do lower the platelet count further. So that is an exclusion to a lot of the different options that we have. But that doesn't mean there's no options. So we're one drug that you may hear about a little bit later, pacritinib, another JAK inhibitor that's being developed, does not lower the platelets so much. It's being developed specifically for people with low platelets. So that could be an option if you haven't already used that. There are some other studies that are going on with things like interferons or some of the IMiD medications like lenalidomide or the old thalidomide that you might remember hearing about way back when, that are being used in studied for people with MPNs too. There's also a group of drugs called TGF-beta inhibitors. One of them, I know Andrew and I are both participating in a study through the MPN Research Consortium, which is a small group of investigators around the country that have gotten together and formed this consortium, this group that we do clinical trials together and other research together. We do have a trial with a TGF-beta inhibitor, basically targets an inflammatory mechanism that we don't think lowers platelets and may help to, and may be a completely different avenue that your disease hasn't seen before. So that something like that might be an option too.
All right, and the last question, sorry, Kristen, but I think this is an important one because I think I know the answer to this, and that is, do my doctors have to enter me into a trial? And like, for example, your hematologist.
Yes, for clinical trials, yes, you need to go through specific sites that have the trial open and available, meaning that they have all of the infrastructure and the resources available already and everything already set up to actually be able to give you the medication and follow you over time, monitor you over time. So yes, a doctor does. It doesn't have to be your current doctor. Your current doctor can probably help link you into other places if they don't have a specific treatment or a specific trial available. They can help you link you up with somewhere else that will, but you would have to go there. How often you would have to go there would depend on exactly what the trial requirements were. But yes, you can't just go online and sign up necessarily, but you can go online and search these things out and find contact information to be able to reach out to the doctors and the teams about them.
All right, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I know you're going to stay with us. And at the end, when there are some other questions that I'll ask both you and Dr. Kurkendal. And for now, thank you again, Kristen. That was very informative. I'm very happy you were with us. So now we're going to move to our industry partner updates. And our first industry partner you'll hear from is Laura Eichhorn, who is the COO of Imago Biosciences. Laura?
So thank you, Anne, Kathleen, the MPN advocacy team for your tireless dedication to the MPN patient community. Thank you, Dr. Pettit, for that great overview for everyone and education on what clinical trials are all about. Our company, Imago Biosciences, is one of those companies that is performing clinical research in both myeloproliferative neoplasms, myelofibrosis, as well as essential thrombocythemia. I just want to talk a few seconds about Anne and Kathleen and both their commitment and dedication that they've shown throughout the years. They've both very passionate and supportive of all of the patients. So whether you're a newly diagnosed patient, a family member, or a support person, I definitely encourage you to take advantage of all the wonderful resources that Anne and Kathleen offer and the entire team offer. A little bit about Imago Biosciences. We're a private company. We were founded in 2012 and based in South San Francisco, California. As I said earlier, we're currently focused on the treatment of myeloproliferative neoplasms. And you know too well, these diseases pose great challenges to the physicians that treat you as well as the patients and their families. Our approach is a little bit unique. It is to target the genes that regulate the blood formations, specifically those regulated by the epigenetic enzymes such as LSD1, which is an enzyme regulating the maturation of blood cells in bone marrow. Our drug, bomedemstat, also known as IMG 7289, was discovered by our company internally in 2015, and it is an LSD1 inhibitor. This is an oral medication, a capsule, that is taken once a day. Back in 2016, bomedemstat was first studied in patients with leukemia, both as a single agent, so a drug by itself, as well as a drug in combination with a commonly prescribed drug for that disease called ATRA. 1 year later, we began studying bomedemstat in patients with myelofibrosis. The goal of the treatment of myelofibrosis is to improve not only the symptoms, reduce the spleen size, but also to reduce the number of malignant cells in the hope of changing the outcome for all of our patients. Bomedemstat is also being studied for the treatment of essential thrombocythemia with the goal of reducing the platelet count to normal. So I will say that bomedemstat is a unique drug. It's very patient specific in its dosing. So there is personalized medicine taking place during our clinical trials. All of our clinical studies are currently in phase 2B, so the latter stages of phase 2B development. We also have a single site in the US that is also receiving patients for polycythemia vera. The FDA granted bomedemstat fast track status for the treatment of both myelofibrosis and essential thrombocythemia, and more recently, bomedemstat was granted PRIME status in the EU, similar to an FDA status, a status given to drugs that hold promise for new clinical benefit to patients. The myelofibrosis study is currently ongoing in the US and elsewhere in the world. The results have been presented at several hematologic meetings to date. There have been no safety signals. Most patients experience improvement in their symptoms and shrinkage of their spleen cells. And most recently, bomedemstat is able to reduce the number of malignant cells, which was an exciting result, and we anticipate based on similar observations in mouse studies, such as the ones that Dr. Pettit explained to you earlier. Dr. Pettit, ironically, was one of the presenters of our data, and she is a clinical investigator on our study and presented our data back in December at the most recent ASH meeting. Imago is accepting patients into both studies, MF and ET, and would welcome any inquiries. The second slide in my deck should be flipping, and that is information on how you can reach out to Imago for more information, as well as 2 clinical study sites that we have set up for both of our active enrolling clinical studies. So as I said earlier, bomedemstat is also being studied in the treatment of polycythemia vera at a single site, which is University of Miami. What's upcoming in the future for clinical research for Imago? Hopefully this year, we will begin a study of bomedemstat in combination with ruxolitinib for the treatment of myelofibrosis, trying to determine if there are any additional clinical benefit of combining those 2 agents, given that ruxolitinib, as you've heard, is the current standard of care. We're also currently conducting research in the use of bomedemstat and related compounds for the treatment of leukemia, sickle cell disease, and solid tumors. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining today. And if you're interested in learning more about the company and about our clinical research, please either visit the website as projected on your screen or the clinicaltrials.gov website also that Dr. Pettit introduced you to, and those are the identifiers for our studies. Thanks so much, Anne. I appreciate everything.
Thank you, Laura, and we appreciate the partnership with Imago Biosciences. Thank you. So our next partner that you'll hear from is Constellation Pharmaceuticals, and Daniel Hennessy is the Vice President of Medical Affairs. And you will get a brief update from him, and we're very happy to have you with us, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I also want to extend a gratitude to MPN Advocacy and Education International for this opportunity. Again, my name is Dan Hennessy. I'm the Vice President of Medical Affairs at Constellation Pharmaceuticals. We are based outside of Boston and Cambridge, and we have over 12 years of discovery and development history focused on epigenetics and cancer biology. All of our therapeutic candidates were discovered internally, and they are the product of our expertise in gene targeting and also in disease states where gene targeting and gene control matters, such as myelofibrosis. Our lead compound is a BET inhibitor known as pelabresib, or CPI-0610. And we're developing this as a potential treatment for myelofibrosis. As you know, myelofibrosis is characterized by deterioration of bone marrow, and several clinical hallmarks of the disease include enlarged spleen, as Dr. Pettit had spoken to, and also constitutional symptoms such as fatigue and night sweats. On the laboratory end, we see anemia and cytopenias, and then histologically, bone marrow fibrosis. These collectively represent the major hallmarks of myelofibrosis. Currently approved therapies have an impact on the first two hallmarks, the spleen and symptoms. Yet what we understand from speaking with physicians and opinion leaders and patients in the community, we understand that a deeper and more durable benefit on these parameters would be valuable. But fundamentally, myelofibrosis is a disease characterized by the deteriorating bone marrow function, and thus there remains significant unmet needs in the other hallmarks, which are anemia and bone marrow fibrosis. Anemia remains a significant limiting factor for dosing of certain medications that you'll hear about, and also the process of receiving blood transfusion imposes a significant burden on patients who require such transfusion support. And today, there's no therapy that can truly modify the course of myelofibrosis disease process other than stem cell transplantation. And we're therefore very excited to be exploring ways that BET inhibition and those pathways that are impacting gene control of myelofibrosis can deliver improvements across all four hallmarks of myelofibrosis disease. Constellation is currently conducting several clinical trials, including a phase 2 trial of pelabresib in myelofibrosis. And at the end of last year, we initiated our phase 3 trial, the MANIFEST-2 trial in JAK-naive patients with myelofibrosis. We all recognize the need for new therapies in myelofibrosis that address all of the areas of unmet need, and we're working very hard to develop such a therapy. At Constellation, our clinical research and medical affairs teams are deeply invested in a very scientific approach to bringing new therapies to patients. And our interest and commitments to patients and caregivers extends across the MPN community, as we have some additional early stage programs that may have utility in myelofibrosis and other myeloproliferative neoplasms. Thank you for your time today, and I'll conclude this talk.
Thank you so much, Dan. We so appreciate it, and we appreciate the partnership with Constellation. Thank you so much. So moving on, we're going to hear from our partners, Obvi, and Frank Cornell is the medical director there. Frank, would you like to bring us up to date on what's happening in the MPN space?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Wonderful. Good. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here today. My name is Frank Cornell, and I'm a hematologist. I joined AbbVie about a year ago, and I oversee the myelofibrosis program within U.S. Medical Affairs. Prior to joining AbbVie, I worked as an academic hematologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center down in Nashville, Tennessee. And, one of the things I would often tell my patients is that you're your own best advocate. And I admire you for being here today to give us in the pharmaceutical industry the opportunity to speak to you about some of the work and research that we're doing, and for learning from some of the best experts out there about some of the research and clinical trials that are happening. Since joining AbbVie, I've been so impressed by the work and dedication of everyone I work with to advance the care of many hematological malignancies, and specifically myelofibrosis, to hopefully one day bring a new treatment option available to you. At AbbVie, we are developing a drug called navitoclax for myelofibrosis. Navitoclax is an investigational agent. It is not currently approved by the FDA. It's a medication taken by mouth, and we're combining it with Jacobi because these two medications work well together in a synergistic way to fight and kill myelofibrosis cells. And it appears this combination works even in the presence of resistance to Jacobi, based on the laboratory and clinical research that we've conducted. And so we think that this therapy has a lot of promise for myelofibrosis, and it's currently being evaluated in 3 clinical trials. The first study is a phase 2 study called REFINE. You may have heard it called M16109. And this is evaluating the combination of navitoclax with Jacobi in patients with both previously treated and newly diagnosed myelofibrosis. I'll mention there's also an arm with just navitoclax alone without the presence of Jacobi. This study is ongoing and enrolling patients in about 25 centers across the United States, as well as many other centers around the globe. The other 2 studies are both phase 3 clinical trials. The first is called Transform 1. This is for newly diagnosed myelofibrosis. And the second trial is called Transform 2 for relapsed myelofibrosis. Both studies are, again, evaluating the combination of navitoclax and ruxolitinib. Again, both studies are open and enrolling patients in many sites across the United States and around the world. If you'd like more information about any of the studies, there's a website that's already been mentioned called myelofibrosisresearch.com. On the site, you can get more information about the studies I've discussed. There's a questionnaire on the site as well that can help you determine if you might be eligible for the study. That ends my update. Thank you for the opportunity again to speak today, and I'll hand it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Frank. Gosh, this is why it is so important that our patients hear from all of you, because so often we'll get a phone call and the question will be, are there any studies going on? Is there anything that we can become involved in? And I do think that that interest is so important. What's happening at the biopharma level is so important, but to bring the 2 together is there are going to be some challenges always, but that is so very vital and so important. But thank you very much. We'll move on and hear from, our partner that's been with us forever, Insight Corporation, who has supported us throughout the years. We so appreciate them. And we'll hear from Jennifer Antonacci, who's the Senior Director of U.S. Public Affairs. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, Ann. It's so great to see you. Thanks everybody, and appreciate the time. As we've already talked about, I'm so happy to be here to represent Insight, and so grateful to you and Kathleen for giving me just a couple of minutes to speak about Insight and of course our commitment to patients. We work and study these diseases on a daily basis, but it's in moments like this, these kinds of webinars, when we hear from the leading researchers and also questions that are being raised that really help us continue to connect, and we never want to lose that. So we're very grateful for that opportunity. For those of you who may not know Insight, we are a,
I understand there might be some echoing. I'll try and fix that. I apologize. So we are a Wellington, Delaware-based biopharma company. As Anne said, we've been around for quite a number of years. Many of you may know that one of our most important commitments is to make sure that there's access to the medications that we produce. And one of the things I wanted to make sure I covered at Anne's request was for anyone who may not be aware, we do have a program called Insight Cares that can help assist appropriate patients and healthcare professionals who need to access our products. We have expanded some of our enrollment criteria recently, and we do encourage all eligible patients to enroll, especially in difficult times like we're experiencing now. And just because I know the audio isn't great, I may just wrap my time up here. And apologies for the rough audio. I'll kick it back to you, Anne. Thanks.
Let me just say this, thank you very much. And we know that you were having some technical difficulties today, Jen, but I will say that I've been on this journey with Insight for many years, and that Jacobi is working very well in so many patients, and we're grateful for that. It was, the first drug approved by the FDA specifically for MPN patients. So that's something to be very proud of. It's now being used in combination with other drugs, and the Insight Cares program, if you have a problem receiving or getting the medication, please call them, because their criteria is very, very open and very reasonable, and you can, they may be able to help you. So thank you so much, Jen. Sorry about the audio issues, but I think it's on your end.
I think so too.
Okay, so moving right along, we will move on to our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Kurkendal from Moffit Cancer Center in Florida. Boy, do we wish we were there right now, Andrew. It is freezing here. And Andrew has spoken at several of our events. He participated in our physician's first ever MPN Physician Summit in San Francisco just before the lockdown. You're doing wonderful things at Moffit, and I want to introduce you because a lot of our folks don't know you, and I want to make sure that they do know who you are and what you're doing, and we so appreciate your time today, Dr. Kurkendal.
Thanks for having me. So yes, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. As Anne mentioned, I'm down in Tampa, Florida, and I actually just had to take off my jacket before this since it was in the 50s today. So obviously quite cold here. I'm sure everyone's really feeling for me. So, but I wanted to take the opportunity today. I know Kristen gave a great talk on clinical trials and kind of the process of getting into a clinical trial, what a clinical trial entails. And I wanted to kind of highlight what's going on currently within the clinical trials in myeloproliferative neoplasms, talk a little bit about how to conceptually understand the kind of overwhelming information that comes with the potential of clinical trials. And then also hopefully get you guys excited about things that are coming down the pipeline or that are entering the late stages of development. And so I put together a very rough slide this morning to try to represent what we think about when Kristen or I is at our institution and we're trying to bring clinical trials to our institution to better serve our patient population. And I think that, if we think about this in the context of other diseases, it may be a little bit simpler. And so if you're running a breast cancer program and you're thinking about what clinical trials to bring, you may be thinking about, okay, we need a trial for people that have newly diagnosed disease. We need a trial for people that have metastatic disease. We need a trial for people that have certain markers. We need a trial for after surgery. So there's different areas, of the disease process that you want to make sure you have something to offer patients. And then maybe you don't want 3 or 4 trials for people that have hormone receptor metastatic disease, because then those trials will compete with each other and you won't be able to adequately enroll. And so these are all things we think about when we're building up our kind of our armamentarium of clinical trials. And that's why you may find out that a trial is open in Michigan that isn't open in Tampa, or vice versa. And so in myelofibrosis, it certainly isn't that easy. We don't have, I would say that because it's such a heterogeneous disease, not everyone presents with the same symptoms. Not everyone presents with disease that can be easily kind of classified into stage 1, 2, 3, 4, like we would do with maybe solid tumors. And so the way I kind of think about it is that every trial tends to have a goal as far as what it's trying to achieve in regards to efficacy. So what is the efficacy goal? And this is kind of notwithstanding the fact that our early phase trials are really focused on safety. But while we definitely want all of these new drugs to be safe, ultimately the goal down the road is to have these drugs be effective. And so even when we are in the early stages of developing clinical trials, and pharmaceutical companies are early stages of developing trials, you have an idea of how you want this drug to be effective for patients. And so that even occurs early on. And so with myelofibrosis, you'd think, okay, the ideal efficacy goal would be to cure the disease, and certainly it is. But I would say historically, we haven't been able to really come even close to achieving that. And so we have these more minor efficacy goals, or more specific efficacy goals, as it pertains to the specific symptoms that our patients experience. And so just looking solely at myelofibrosis, because I think that this is this really encapsulates the challenges that we have. You could see that at the top here, I've listed efficacy goals as being anything from disease control, meaning, okay, maybe we control the counts, or control the spleen, or control the symptoms, to cytopenia improvement. Okay, instead of controlling things, maybe we want to actually improve the red blood cell count, or improve platelet count, or reduce transfusion requirements. Okay, maybe we're trying to get rid of the fibrosis that's in the bone marrow, and so maybe we'll target that. Perhaps we'll actually try to prove that we have some disease modification, and defining that as a challenge in and of itself. Do we mean eliminating the driver mutation, depending on what driver mutation patients have? Do we mean getting rid of fibrosis? Is it some constellation of that? Or are we just saying we think this works preclinically in the lab? We seem to think this does something to myelofibrosis cells, or cells from patients with myelofibrosis, and therefore we think it's going to work, but we're not really sure. So we're looking at kind of this general response, and these aren't mutually exclusive goals. I mean, certainly if we want to control the disease, we also hope there's maybe some disease modification, but maybe that's a higher bar to reach. And so while you have the efficacy goals at the top, on the other hand, you have kind of the treatment line, or the clinical situation that you have to think about. Okay, are we hoping that this is going to work in the frontline setting? Is this going to work after patients have received a JAK inhibitor? Is this going to work in addition to a JAK inhibitor? We're going to add this on to a JAK inhibitor. Do we think this is only going to work in people that have specific mutations? We call that molecularly targeted treatments. And so we're really only going to look at isolated groups of individuals that show that they have a certain mutation. Or are we going to look at this in the accelerated or blast phase disease? And so there's a lot of different treatment lines or situations that are required to certainly go on trials. And then, at the end of the day, these are kind of a smattering of potential agents that are out there. And this is not comprehensive by any means, but this is this probably encompasses maybe 80 to 90% of the agents that are currently being looked at in myelofibrosis. And you can see that largely, if you look at the trial design, they're clustered into this disease control, cytopenia improvement in either the frontline, post-JAK, or add-on therapy grouping. And we don't have too many drugs that I would say have at least built into the trial saying that they're going to prove disease modification. Maybe imetelstat is the one agent that's trying to demonstrate that by looking at overall survival as an endpoint in a trial. But certainly we're seeing maybe some hints of disease modifications with some of these other agents, such as maybe CPI 0610, but it hasn't really been explicitly listed as the goal. And so you can also see that there's a large white area here that we don't have targeted trials for, and I think that that's where certainly trials will start to pop up over the next 2 or 3 years as we look at more molecularly targeted agents, more agents really focusing on disease modifications once we can figure out a way to appropriately define that. And certainly we desperately need novel concepts and agents for this accelerated or blast phase group of patients that represents a real challenge for us. And so I think that this is a very rough diagram to kind of explain when we're looking at patients with for trials, we're trying to make sure we have the appropriate goal in mind for that patient. But at the same time, the trial often dictates that it has to be, in a certain location in the treatment planning or in the treatment continuum. And so, it may be that we think there's a great agent that we might help with anemia, but you've never been treated with a prior JAK inhibitor, and so it may be a challenge to get it on. So these are all things that we're thinking about, and this adds an additional layer of complexity to clinical trials. But at the same time, I would also argue it provides a lot of opportunities to develop novel trial concepts. And I know Kristen and myself and a lot of other investigators are really focused on identifying these areas of need and developing investigator-initiated trial concepts that can better serve our patients that may not be completely served with our current trial armamentarium. So the next thing I'd move on to, and I don't have a slide for this, is I will talk about a few of the agents that I think are coming down the pipeline that have some considerable excitement around them. Anytime you're following a disease field and hoping to see what's coming out next, I think the quickest thing to do is look, are there any ongoing phase 3 clinical trials? Because as Kristen mentioned in her talk, there's a certain progression that needs to occur to get a drug on the market and available to patients. And it starts with a phase 1 safety trial, moves to a phase 2 trial. Maybe we're trying to get a little more people exposed to the drug, see if it's effective, and then it moves on to phase 3. And a phase 3 study is obviously an enormous financial undertaking from the company sponsoring the study. And to move to that, there needs to be considerable optimism that this really could be something that can show the ability to come to market and help patients. And never before have we seen the amount of phase 3 studies for myelofibrosis than we have currently. And by my count, I believe we have somewhere on the order of 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 6 phase 3 clinical trials for myelofibrosis that are either open or close to opening. 2 of those are agents that have had previous phase 3 studies, such as pacritinib and momelotinib. And these are JAK inhibitors that are likely to benefit subsets of patients that are currently underserved by our current JAK inhibitors. So pacritinib is being looked at very specifically in patients with low platelets. And momelotinib is being looked at very specifically in patients that have anemia symptoms and splenomegaly and have previously been treated with ruxolitinib. So I think seeing how those 2 agents are able to show their benefit in these subsets of myelofibrosis patients will be very important, and we would always love to have more agents available to us so that we can really individualize our therapy for patients. In addition to that, we have 3 more kind of combination strategies that are entering into phase 3, and that would be with CPI 0610, the BET inhibitor, the navitoclax and parsaclisib. So these 3 studies are looking at a combination with their agent plus ruxolitinib versus ruxolitinib in the frontline setting to see if we can get additional benefits in terms of spleen volume reduction, but also in terms of overall disease control and duration of response, because we do know that while ruxolitinib and fedratinib are able to give us good spleen responses and symptom responses, those are not lifelong responses, and often patients will have to come off of those medications somewhere around 3 years in. About half of patients will be, at least for ruxolitinib's sake, will be off of ruxolitinib for a variety of reasons. And so we think that potentially adding agents on that have some synergistic properties may be able to deepen the responses we get with JAK inhibition. Additionally, there's a phase 3 study that will be opening with imetelstat, which is a telomerase inhibitor. This is a very intriguing agent, as it's just a little bit different than what we are used to with JAK inhibition. And imetelstat is an agent that's really been shown in the lab to have the potential for disease modification. And in a phase 2 study, patients that were a really high-risk population of myelofibrosis patients with high-risk mutations, a lot of triple negative disease, which is a very challenging molecular cohort to treat. Patients had some good responses, but also lived a lot longer than we would have expected them to live. And so our group, as well as at MD Anderson and some European groups, have looked at how patients do after having to come off ruxolitinib for a variety of reasons, and it really looks like survival in that group is quite poor, maybe 12 to 14 months. And now that's not, for everyone, there's different reasons to come off ruxolitinib, but however, that seems to be a consistent figure. It's 12 to 14 months survival post ruxolitinib. And this was a group of patients that was looked at in the imetelstat study, and yet the patients on the study lived, close to between 2 and 3 years, so close to 30 months. And so the question is, does this really represent something? It's tough to show that in a phase 2 study. There is no comparator to that arm. And so looking at this in a phase 3 study compared to best available therapy and really seeing if there's a signal there will be something that's very important. And it represents a change in the sense that we're using overall survival as an endpoint as opposed to spleen volume reduction or symptom score. And I think this is a very important endpoint to see if we can actually improve survival for our patients. And so that's an exciting study that is ongoing as well. And then luspatercept, which Kristen mentioned briefly, which is a inhibitor or looks at targeting the TGF-beta pathway, or TGF-beta superfamily, and really is the goal of that is to improve anemia. Luspatercept is actually getting incorporated into phase 3 studies as well to see if that's something that can improve anemia in myelofibrosis patients. It's already shown in phase 2 studies in patients on ruxolitinib who are requiring transfusions that it has some activity to reduce the need for those transfusions. So that's certainly exciting there. So that's kind of the myelofibrosis disease late stage clinical trial development that's going on. So a lot of phase 3 studies, a lot of excitement there. I could go on for a longer period of time about the excitement that's in phase 1 and phase 2 studies, because there is certainly a lot of interesting science that is now being brought into the clinic. But that would be, hopefully we'll see that evolve over the next few years, and maybe some of those agents can move into the phase 3 trials as well. Briefly touching on polycythemia vera and ET, or essential thrombocythemia, I think that there's these will always be diseases that lag behind, or at least the drug development in these diseases will lag behind myelofibrosis somewhat, mainly because I think that it's just natural to look at agents in the most severe setting and then kind of start to then look at them in the more chronic phases of the disease. PV and ET are diseases that have a better prognosis associated with them than myelofibrosis, and certainly safety is paramount when treating these. Our standard of therapy, it includes active surveillance or observation for a lot of these patients. And so when we're looking at bringing new agents there, we have to make sure that they're safe and they're providing clinical benefit. That being said, there is a lot of excitement over a couple of agents, especially in polycythemia vera right now. Ropeg interferon is a new interferon formulation that's longer acting than our previous formulations, appears to be quite safe. And we do not see a lot of the toxicity that we've seen with prior interferon formulations. And certainly we've gotten long-term data with Ropeg interferon that suggests that it is superior to hydroxyurea in terms of long-term blood count control, and certainly very optimistic findings in terms of reducing the JAK2 allele burden. And that's very exciting in those patients. The future for that agent in polycythemia vera in patients in the United States is somewhat uncertain, but hopefully we'll be getting some more clarity on that in the coming months. But this is definitely something we'd love to have access to in the United States, to be able to offer this to patients with polycythemia vera. Ropeg is also being looked at in essential thrombocythemia, and so that's an ongoing clinical trial that we should keep tabs on to see if that's going to be an option for those patients as well. There's also an agent in polycythemia vera that just released results at our ASH meeting called PTG-300. This is a hepcidin mimetic, and the goal of this agent is to reduce the need for phlebotomies in polycythemia vera patients that are requiring phlebotomies. And with a caveat that it may be able to increase iron stores. As we know, with polycythemia vera patients, we treat with phlebotomies. We take blood from them to reduce their hematocrit to safer levels. In doing so, we make them iron deficient, which then leads to a whole host of other symptoms. But we tend to say, okay, well we're okay with it because the numbers look good, and then that's kind of a not a great long-term plan is to treat one disease by causing other problems. And so PTG-300 is looking at this group of patients to see if it can reduce the need for phlebotomy by modulating this protein called hepcidin. Hepcidin is a master regulator of iron, and so when we provide PTG-300, it mimics hepcidin, actually allows us to increase iron stores and yet restricts iron for use by the bone marrow, and so it actually reduces hematocrit levels. And so initial results were presented on, I think, 19 patients at ASH this year, and it really looks like this agent does what it set out to do, which patients that were requiring phlebotomies quite frequently prior to going on studies, essentially the need for phlebotomies was eliminated after starting this agent. So the continued development of this drug will be very interesting to watch. Kristen also mentioned IMG 7289 or bomedemstat, and that's being looked at not just in myelofibrosis, but also in ET due to its impact on platelets. And so that'll be very interesting to see where that goes as well. And then if we were looking at exciting things, I think it's also nice to know that there's actually vaccine trials that are starting to get up and going, especially in Europe. Looking at calreticulin or CALR mutated disease and seeing if that's something that could be targeted with vaccines. CALR is a very interesting mutation that occurs and actually presents a therapeutic opportunity. And so immune therapy for CALR mutated disease may be something that we're talking about more over the next year or two. And then I think that something that Kristen alluded to earlier as well which is the MPN Research Consortium that we're both a part of. I think this is something that is just amazing for patients. This is a grant-funded consortium of 11 centers with expertise in myeloproliferative neoplasms. The goal of this consortium is to bring together centers that have expertise both in the preclinical or basic science lab study of myeloproliferative neoplasms, as well as centers like our own that can run clinical trials and have a high volume of myeloproliferative disease patients. And the goal is that we can kind of share patient samples with the group so that they can do the appropriate research, find novel targets, and as soon as we find a novel target in the lab, we can rapidly get that into the clinic and get all of these centers on board to enroll patients on the trial. And I think this is really like putting down the gas pedal on the ability to run clinical trials and come up with novel ideas to run clinical trials. And this is something that I think can't go understated how important this is for the community to be able to get everyone on the same page and working in the right, working on the same team. And so This is, instead of competition, this is collaboration, and this has the opportunity to be great for patients. So with that, I will step back and allow some questions, but I think that that's a general overview of what's exciting and coming down the pipeline.
I can't thank you enough. I mean, to sit and watch you just speak randomly, just so casually and so comfortingly about all of the trials, and I marvel at this. I really do, because there was absolutely so little going on years ago. I love what you just said about collaboration, and thus our intent at this organization is to keep all the lines of communication open between patient, physician, and researcher, industry. All those three areas have to communicate with one another. And I'm so glad you said that. I have tons of questions, and some that were asked of Kristen, but I want to ask this of you. And that is, have you seen any adverse side effects to those patients that have had the COVID vaccine?
No, I haven't. And I even have a cohort of patients that have systemic mastocytosis, which often, have a lot of reactions to various medications and stuff. And even those patients, I'm advising to get the vaccine. We know that there is the potential for allergic reactions, but all of those can be appropriately treated if they do happen. They're very rare. But still, we can treat those allergic reactions, and I think the risk of that is much lower than the risk of actually contracting COVID. We know the toll that can take, and so no, we've started vaccinating our patients last week, or I think a week or so ago, and I have not heard any adverse side effects from the vaccination so far, other than the expected sore arm, 12 hours afterwards or so.
So we talked a little bit about diversity, ethnic diversity, different demographics that can enter clinical trials, and we're lacking in so many areas in that regard. But what about the comorbidities of a clinical trial, like somebody that has something else going on that would love to be in a trial, but can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that is a challenge, because there's two goals. Obviously, there's two sides to a clinical trial. One, we're trying to test an agent, we're trying to test a drug, we're trying to see if it works. And two, we're trying to offer our patients opportunities to have access to these novel agents. And I think that needs to be carefully considered. Oftentimes, as someone who writes trials and goes through this process, sometimes you're sitting there and copying and pasting inclusion and exclusion criteria. But I think it's very important for researchers as we do this, and especially the pharmaceutical companies that are bringing these agents into trials, to think critically about each of those exclusion criteria, because those are going to affect a patient. And some of those criteria need to be carefully thought out, such as oftentimes we're looking at very lab values that patients miss trials by just fractions of a point, and whether or not that fraction is important. And so I think that it's a challenge to folks that are writing the trials, be it the investigators or the companies, to really make sure you try to extend those exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria to get everyone who's possibly going to benefit into that. We get that if a drug has a potential of having some liver toxicity, there has to be some exclusion of patients that have some liver dysfunction, but make sure that you're allowing patients to get in if you really think your drug's gonna be safe otherwise. And I will say that, having participated in trial writing workshops recently, this is a focus for everyone who's being taught how to write a trial, is to think critically about making sure you're allowing people with access. I think that one example is, I was just recently in a discussion about a trial, and there's always exclusion of, if you've had a previous cancer in the past 5 years, you can't be on. And I think we all know that that's a little bit over restrictive. And so now I think the wording is changing in a lot of trials to suggest that if you have an active cancer that's going to influence your participation on the trial, that's an exclusion. And so I think I think it's moving in the right direction, that we're trying to only exclude the comorbidities that we think would actually put patients at an increased risk of harm.
This is an excellent question, if I do say so myself. Some patients receive phlebotomy on a regular basis. Are there any studies that may benefit from those donations, from that blood?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the MPN Research Consortium as well is actually actively collecting those samples, and there are at most institutions there are basic science researchers that would love those cells. And I think within the MPN Research Consortium, we have this group of sites that we try to meet different metrics of we get samples from different people, and phlebotomy bags are perfect to use. I would say there are challenges in using that, because oftentimes patients are giving phlebotomies at sites that are not set up to collect and distribute those samples, and so it's something that often has to be logistically figured out, but it can be done. And so I would advise whoever asked that question, if it's someone who's providing phlebotomies, to talk with their physician and to see if there's a researcher or someone at that institution or some way to provide that sample.
Getting back to the comorbidity question, there are a subset of patients that have CLL, and would that exclude them from an MPN trial?
Sometimes, yeah. I think that's a perfect example of what I kind of was alluding to with the wording around these secondary malignancies and secondary cancers, and historically that's been kind of one of those excluded entities. They'll say if you have a second cancer in the past 5 years, you can't go on the study. Maybe they'll allow a squamous cell skin cancer or prostate cancer that doesn't require therapy. But we know there's other malignancies out there that don't really play a role in this, that are monitored with surveillance, and CLL is one of those. But myeloma or smoldering myeloma or MGUS, some of these other kind of long-term, low-grade malignancies, really shouldn't be excluded, but it really depends on the wording of the specific trial that you're looking into. And so it certainly can be excluded, but going forward, I think that the trials would do better for making the wording a little bit more open.
Thank you so very much. And we'll probably have more questions for you, but I'm going to move on at this moment. All right, thank you so very much. I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you all are. I want to remind everyone that you will be receiving a message from us after this program, probably in a few days, with the links and to all the trials, along with the recording of this program. So, know that you will be getting that. I want to introduce a person who has become a very dear friend of mine, actually. I met her probably in 2005. And she has been just a remarkable person. She is a patient. She has spoken at many of our programs. And I love to have her talk to you because she's been in several clinical trials. She has never stopped. She is a go-getter. She volunteers. She does everything. She works out every day. I just love her as a person and a human being, and as a friend now after all these years. But I'd like you to meet Marilyn. And hi, darling. And she is going to share her clinical trial experiences.
Hi, Anne. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Oh, good. I've got my visual and my audio, so I guess I'm good. Well, thank you so much, Anne. Yes, I've known Anne for quite a while, and I have been an MPN patient for the last 20 years. So listening to all these doctors, we've come a long way, baby, because there were not even any mutations known when I was first diagnosed. But through my course of the disease, I have been on 5 different drugs, and 3 of those have been clinical trials. So I started out with, only the standard of care was the main drug. When I started out with PV was hydroxyurea, and after that was not working any longer for a few years is when I'd been hearing about the interferon or Pegasus, and the discussion of the MPN Research Consortium. My local hematologist at that time was part of that. So in order to get on the Pegasus, he had suggested we wait for the trial to open up, which I did, although it took quite a while for that to get approved. And in the meantime, I was only on it for a short time because other issues were happening. And that's one thing I would say about a clinical trial too, for anyone interested. If you're on a clinical trial and showing that things are not going well, you will be removed from the trial. So you're not on the trial, you know, for any length of time and not showing improvement. And from there, fortunately, the very first drug FDA approved was Jakafi. So I did start that drug, but I did find that I had an allergic reaction to that. So that was very short-lived, like one dose. From there, it was very important then to find a specialist, because at that point in my life career of this disease, there was nothing else readily available. So it was good to find a specialist who knew what was happening. And that's when the other second drug that was coming out was the fedratinib drug. So I was able to get on that trial also. And that one was short-lived for about 11 months when that one was pulled by the FDA. But also my third drug trial came after that, and that was also through the specialist that helped me get on, because I had done well on the JAK inhibitors since my mutation was the JAK2V617. So we knew that was good. So that was where my third trial came in, and I actually was on that trial for 6 years when, unfortunately, that trial didn't make it to phase 3 due to finances and things. So at that point in time, in the meantime, the fedratinib had come back and had been approved. So currently I am back on fedratinib now, not as a trial, but as an actual drug that I'm taking. So over the course of the 20 years, it's been a learning experience. And the other thing I would say, which is different from what I've heard Dr. Pettit say now, was that when I went on the trials, you really had to show that you had failed on the original drug you were on. Like, first of all, hydroxyurea wasn't working any longer, so that's when I went to the interferon. And even when I got on the JAK inhibitors, on the fedratinib, that was part of the protocol that I had to have failed on Jakafi. And what was interesting about that protocol was they said you had to be on Jakafi for 2 weeks and shown that it was failing. Well, I had one dose with an allergic reaction. So actually the specialist I went to at that time, he actually had to get the protocol changed so that I could be included in that trial. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get on. But from listening to Dr. Pettit, she had said apparently now you may be able to get on clinical trials without having to go through the standard treatment. So that has been my 20 years experience, and I'm still here and still hoping, maybe not going as strong as I was, but I'm still going along, and I look forward to continue. And I would also just like to say that if people are having any difficulty with the drugs they're on, they really do need to be an advocate for themselves and look into the NIH site, clinical trials. And if your local hematologist does not know, then you've really got to look into specialty teaching hospital or whatever to get the help that's needed. So, but I thank you very much, Anne, for allowing me to share some of my story with you.
I'm in awe of you as usual, because you're fantastic. You seem to always be doing so well, and I love that you continue to volunteer for the betterment of humanity. And I'm just happy to see you doing so well, and thank you for sharing. And we'll call on you again. You'll be with us next week and we'll get into some more meat next week, because that will be for physicians that need to hear from patients that have been on trials. That there may be others joining you. And but Marilyn, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Anne. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. So we will move on, and I want to remind everyone again that this is recorded. It will be available to all of you, and the links to the trials will be present. We're also seeking patients that are transfusion dependent, just to get their stories if anyone out there is transfusion dependent. I'm going to move along now and to our industry partners that would like to present their updates. I want to hear from Jiran, who Dr. Kurkendal mentioned, Dr. Faye Feller, and is the Vice President of Clinical Development at Jiran, and I've known Faye forever as well. And Faye, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your update.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks, Anne and Kathleen and everyone at MPN Advocacy for inviting me to speak today. I mean, it really is remarkable what your organization does to bring together patients and industry providers as well as clinicians so that we can all have informed, educated discussions. It's really, thank you for all that you do for the patients and for the community. So as Anne mentioned, my name is Faye Feller, and I'm the head of clinical development at Jiran. I'm a hematologist by training with a specialty in myeloid diseases such as myelofibrosis and the other MPNs. At Jiran, we are a late-stage biopharmaceutical company and currently developing imetelstat, which you heard Dr. Kurkendal mention. Imetelstat is an inhibitor of telomerase, and we're looking at it in the treatment of hematologic myeloid malignancies. We recently completed a phase 2 study of imetelstat in intermediate 2 and high-risk myelofibrosis patients who were relapsed after or refractory to JAK inhibitor treatment. This study, which was known as NYF 2001 or EMBARK, it showed that there was a potential for survival benefit, and it also showed an encouraging symptom response rate, especially in these patients who had failed JAK inhibitor treatment. Subsequently, we have recently opened, and it's currently open for enrollment, a phase 3 study in intermediate 2 and high-risk myelofibrosis patients who are refractory to JAK inhibitor treatment. This is, as most phase 3 studies are, a randomized, open-label, controlled study comparing imetelstat treatment to best available therapy. So this study is known as NYF 3001 or Impact MS, and you can see on the slide here a link to our website that will give you further details about the study, as well as it is posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So Impact MS, the primary endpoint for the trial, as Dr. Kurkendal mentioned, is overall survival, and we're looking at symptom response as a key secondary endpoint. We plan on over 100 sites to be open globally, and you can, again, see the details on our website at jiran.com. We look forward to working together to improve the lives of MS patients, and I thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you so much, Faye. Very well done. Thank you. So now we'd like to hear from Pharmacentia, who has ROPEG, and Anna Sethi, if you are there. Oh, there. Hello.
Hi, Anne, and thank you, Anne and Kathleen, for this wonderful opportunity. This is the first time I'm attending this, and I'm the Associate Medical Director with Pharmacentia. Just a brief introduction to our company. So Pharmacentia is a global company. We have offices all over the world, including US, Taiwan, China, Japan, and South Korea. In the US, we are based out of Boston. We have been around for a while. We were founded in 2003, and in 2008 was when we first discovered the first biologic that we have, that is ropeg interferon alpha 2b, or P1101, which is a pegylated interferon alpha, and Dr. Kurkendal also covered briefly about us during his presentation. Ropeg interferon is a subcutaneous medication that is dosed once every 2 weeks. And following our results in the PROUD-PV study, in our phase 3 PROUD-PV study, and the ongoing continuation trial of PROUD-PV called the CONTI-PV study, in 2019, the European Commission approved ropeg interferon for patients with PV. Today, I'll be going over briefly our phase 3 trial for ropeg interferon in ET, which has been labeled as the SURPASS-ET, and you can see on the slide over here. So SURPASS-ET is a phase 3 trial designed for 52 weeks. It's an open label study, randomized. It's a randomized trial, and it aims to compare the efficacy, safety, and tolerability of ropeg interferon versus enaglaride in a second-line setting. We have about 50 sites globally, and 10 of them are in the US. To be eligible for the trial, the patients have to be classified as high-risk ET patients who are either intolerant or resistant to hydroxyurea and are treatment naive to interferons. The study is currently open for enrollment. And as I mentioned, we have the website over here. You can also find out about this study on clinicaltrials.gov. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your support to the community, and also thank all the investigators and patients.
Yeah, thank you so very much too. This is great information, very good information. So we will move on to Sierra, who is one of our partners as well, and Lauren Musto, Head of Corporate Communications. Lauren, are you there?
I am here, Anne.
Hi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As Anne mentioned, my name is Lauren Musto, and I'm the head of corporate communications at Sierra Oncology. If you're not familiar, Sierra is a late-stage biotechnology company on a quest to deliver targeted therapies that treat rare forms of cancer. Our main focus right now is the development of momelotinib, which is an investigational agent for the treatment of myelofibrosis. Momelotinib is an inhibitor of 3 key signaling pathways that contribute to the major manifestations of this disease. By inhibiting ACVR1 as well as JAK1 and JAK2, we believe that momelotinib has the potential to improve anemia of myelofibrosis, while also improving constitutional symptoms and splenomegaly. We are currently enrolling patients into our ongoing phase 3 clinical trial, which we refer to as the MOMENTUM study. This trial will compare the activity of momelotinib to another treatment called danazol, by assessing the impact that momelotinib has on symptoms, anemia, the need for blood transfusions, splenomegaly, as well as the safety of the product. The trial is now open to enrollment in 21 countries with more than 100 actively enrolling sites, including 15 sites in the US. We expect the results from this trial to be available in 2022. If the study is positive, the regulatory authorities would then have to review and approve the product before it could become commercially available. For more information, we invite you to visit the Momentum Trial website at https://momentumtrial.com. We appreciate the partnership that we have with you, Anne, and your organization, and I thank you for this opportunity to tell you and your listeners about the cool things that we're doing at Sierra Oncology. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you very much, and that was excellent. And again, you will receive a message from us, all of you, on this at this program, and the other constituents in our database will receive a message with this recording of this event and the links to all of those trials. Moving along with our last partner that is with us today, Protagonist, and Nora Boyer, who is the Vice President of Medical Affairs. Thank you for joining us, Nora.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been an amazing program, and I promise to be quick. So Protagonist is a small, publicly traded biotech company. We just have about under 100 employees, and we're located in South San Francisco Bay Area. However, I'm not there. I'm remote, and so I'm in Chicago. Currently evaluating efficacy and safety in an open label phase 2 study in polycythemia vera with our lead candidate, PTG-300. And it's an injectable synthetic peptide mimetic of the natural hormone hepcidin, and you heard Dr. Kurkendal mention it. And I just wanted to go over the ASH December 2020 presentation that we just did, and Doctor mentioned it again. And so there were 18 patients with PV patients that were treated with 300, and it was presented in a podium presentation at ASH. Of the 18 patients treated with 300, the vast majority were able to eliminate therapeutic phlebotomies and maintain a target hematocrit level of less than 45%. The treatment with 300 was also shown to reverse iron deficiency, which can be a serious side effect of regular therapeutic phlebotomies. The early observations suggested a decrease in symptom burden over time, as well as specific mental function, fatigue, and itching. Administration of PTG-300 was well tolerated, with injection site reaction and bruise as the only observed adverse event. You can see on the bottom of my slide are the links to the clinicaltrials.gov and also to another website we have if you'd like to learn more information or if you're interested in participating in the study. And again, thank you very, very much. I'm very impressed with this organization and very fortunate to be a part of it.
Well, we thank you, all of our partners, and this is, you know, it's such an exciting time for all of us, and we just keep trying to make sure that we're communicating all of this information to our patients and to our physicians. And next week we have a physicians meeting about clinical trials. We feel that it is very necessary to include all the physicians that see our patients, not just the hematologists, although many of them are not exposed to this information and don't have it. And so we ask our patients to make sure you take the information that Kathleen's going to be sending to you today to your local physician that you see on a regular basis to join us next week. They will learn a ton of information from not only Drs. Mesa and Dr. Michaels, but also from all of these biopharma companies that are hard at work making new drug therapies for MPN patients. At this time, I would like to thank our doctors today, Dr. Kurkendal and Dr. Pettit. I know how busy all of you are, and we so appreciate your time. And your, you know, I mean, and the work that you're doing at your academic institution. It is so vital and so important. I love the collaboration and collegiality in the physicians that are out there these days. You're terrific to work with, and we so appreciate you, know that, and please be safe. I know you've been vaccinated, but remain safe, and we will be in touch soon. And with all of you on this online webinar, peace be with you, and please be careful, and we will be in touch very soon. You'll receive this message from us very soon today. Thank you.